The emergency lights at Keflavik International Airport sliced through the Arctic darkness like surgical incisions. Red and white strobes painted the frozen tarmac in alternating bursts, while fire trucks and rescue vehicles held their positions along the runway edges, rumbling against the sub-zero wind. Snow swept sideways across the landing lights, and somewhere in the control tower air traffic controllers gripped their consoles with white knuckles. The Boeing 787 Dreamliner had stopped 300 feet from the end of the runway, its engines winding down with a mechanical exhale that seemed to release the accumulated terror of the past 12 hours. Steam rose from the aircraft's belly, where hot hydraulic fluid kissed frozen concrete. For a suspended moment, nothing moved. Then the forward cabin door cracked open and a man stepped into the frame. He wore a gray sweater wrinkled and stretched at the elbows from hours of gripping flight controls never designed for his hands. His jeans showed a small tear near the left knee. His sneakers were unremarkable, the kind available at any discount store for $40. Standing in that doorway, backlit by the dim emergency lighting of the cabin behind him, he looked nothing like the hero the world would soon call him. He looked like a man who had fallen asleep in economy class and awakened inside someone else's nightmare. But the 242 souls behind him understood differently now. They rose from their seats in a wave, first slowly, then all at once, and the sound that filled the cabin existed somewhere between applause and weeping. A woman near the back was praying in Spanish. A businessman in first class kept repeating "thank God" until the words dissolved into pure sound, meaning stripped away by repetition. 12 hours earlier, nobody on this flight had looked at Darnell Braddock twice. He had achieved that particular invisibility reserved for people who occupy spaces where others believe they do not belong. Seat 8A, economy class window position. A black man in a wrinkled sweater reading a paperback novel while business travelers in pressed suits brushed past without acknowledgement. He had boarded early, stowed his carry-on without assistance, and settled into his seat with the practiced efficiency of someone who expected nothing from strangers. The flight attendant had offered him a thin, professional smile and a choice between chicken and pasta. He had chosen pasta. He had been forgettable. He had been ordinary. And in being ordinary, he had become something far more dangerous to the assumptions surrounding him. But that revelation would come later. First, there was Chicago. 36 hours before the flight, Darnell Braddock stood in the kitchen of his Rogers Park apartment, cracking eggs into a ceramic bowl, while early morning light filtered through windows that needed cleaning. The place cost $1,800 monthly, which stretched his budget uncomfortably, but kept Imani enrolled in a decent school district. The refrigerator hummed with an irregular rhythm suggesting imminent mechanical failure. The linoleum floor showed wear patterns from years of foot traffic, but the walls held crayon drawings in every color the rainbow could offer, and the refrigerator door displayed a constellation of gold star stickers and spelling tests marked with enthusiastic red A's. And these things transformed the space into something sacred. Darnell whisked the eggs with a fork, adding milk the way his mother had taught him 3 decades ago in their Detroit kitchen. On the counter beside him sat a lunchbox shaped like a rocket ship, already packed with a turkey sandwich cut diagonally, apple slices arranged in a fan pattern, and 3 Oreo cookies hidden beneath a paper napkin. He had learned that particular trick from Keisha, who had believed that children should discover small surprises in ordinary moments. He tried not to think about Keisha too often. The missing had become a weight he carried everywhere, but some mornings it pressed heavier against his chest than others. The sound of small feet thundering down the hallway announced his daughter's arrival before she exploded into the kitchen with energy that made him wonder if she had somehow learned to convert sunlight directly into motion. Imani Braddock was 7 years old, all limbs and velocity, with her hair styled in 2 puffs that her grandmother had shaped the previous evening. The gap between her front teeth made her smile radiant, and she wore her favorite purple shirt featuring a dinosaur playing basketball, a garment she had selected herself and defended against all suggestions of alternatives. Imani skidded to a stop and examined the stove with the critical assessment of a health inspector. "Those eggs better not have shells in them, Daddy." Darnell raised an eyebrow without turning from the pan. "When have I ever put shells in your eggs last Tuesday? That was one time. One time is still a time, Daddy." He could not argue with that logic. Imani climbed onto her designated stool at the kitchen table leg swinging in the space below and began arranging her napkin with surgical precision. Darnell watched her for a moment, this small person who had somehow become the gravitational center of his entire existence, and he felt the familiar ache of loving something so completely that it terrified him. "I'm going on a trip tomorrow, baby girl." "You remember?" Imani nodded with exaggerated seriousness. "London. For work. You'll be gone 2 days. That's right. Grandma's going to stay with you while I'm away." "I know. She's going to make her famous macaroni and cheese." Darnell smiled as the eggs sizzled in the pan. "And what are the rules while I'm gone?" Imani recited them with the cadence of memorized text, ticking each item on her fingers. "Do my homework before TV. Brush my teeth for 2 whole minutes. Be in bed by 8:30. Don't give Grandma a hard time about anything, and call you every single night before I go to sleep." Perfect. Imani studied him with eyes that seemed capable of penetrating every wall he had constructed around his interior life. She had inherited her mother's eyes. The exact same shade of brown, the identical flecks of gold near the pupils that caught light in particular ways. Some days this resemblance provided comfort. Other days it functioned as a blade. "Daddy, why don't you ever fly the planes yourself?" The question arrived without warning, the way questions from 7-year-olds always do, timed to moments when parents are least prepared. Darnell kept his attention on the eggs, moving them around the pan with deliberate focus. "What do you mean, baby?" "You used to fly planes. Grandma told me about it. She said you were a pilot in the Air Force and you were really, really good at it. So why do you just sit in the regular seats now instead of flying?" Darnell remained quiet for a long moment, considering his response. "That was a long time ago, Imani. Before you were born. Things changed. But why did they change? Because I made a choice." He divided the eggs onto 2 plates, added toast, and carried breakfast to the table. "When you were very little, after Mommy went to heaven, I had to decide what mattered most to me. And it was you. So I stopped flying the big planes so I could be home with you every single night." Imani processed this information with the gravity of a philosopher examining fundamental truths. "But you miss it." "I can tell you miss it, Daddy." Darnell sat down across from his daughter at their small kitchen table. "Sometimes I miss it, but not as much as I would miss you if I wasn't here every day." This answer appeared to satisfy her. She attacked her eggs with enthusiasm, and for several minutes, the only sounds in the kitchen were the scrape of forks against plates and the dying refrigerator's mechanical complaints. Darnell ate his own breakfast and tried not to think about the box stored beneath his bed. The box containing his medals and his wings and the photographs of a younger man standing proud in front of an F-16 Fighting Falcon with the entire sky spread behind him like a promise. He had not opened that box in 4 years. The morning routine proceeded with its established choreography. Teeth-brushed, hair checked in the mirror, backpack secured on small shoulders. Rocket ship lunchbox stowed in the front pocket. Darnell walked Imani the 4 blocks to her elementary school, their hands linked together, her voice providing constant commentary on subjects ranging from the fundamental unfairness of multiplication tables to her friend Madison's new puppy to the scientific improbability of unicorns, which she had recently decided were definitely real despite all available evidence. At the school gate, Imani turned and wrapped her arms around his waist with fierce intensity. She was growing taller. This time next year, she would probably reach his chest. The thought made him proud and melancholic in equal measure, the bittersweet arithmetic of parenthood. "I love you, Daddy. I love you bigger than the sky, baby girl." She grinned, displaying that gap between her front teeth. "Bigger than all the skies." Then she was gone, absorbed into the stream of children flowing toward the building's entrance, and Darnell stood there, watching the space where she had been for longer than was strictly necessary. The October wind picked up, carrying the smell of exhaust and fallen leaves, and somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed its urban song. He turned and walked home with his hands in his jacket pockets, his mind already shifting toward the work waiting on his laptop. Darnell Braddock was a software engineer at a logistics company in downtown Chicago. He wrote code that helped trucks find efficient routes between warehouses and helped those warehouses track inventory movement. It was not glamorous work. It would never make headlines or change the world in dramatic fashion, but it paid $95,000 annually and included health insurance that covered Imani's pediatrician visits and dental checkups and the occasional emergency room trip when playground adventures turned painful. He had chosen this career for the stability, for the predictable hours, for the guarantee of being home every evening in time for dinner and homework and bedtime stories. He had chosen it because it represented the complete opposite of everything he had been before. His apartment contained no evidence of that previous existence. No photographs of him in flight suits, no shadow box displaying medals, no challenge coins or squadron patches or any of the artifacts that military men typically scatter through their living spaces like breadcrumbs marking their identities. Darnell had packed all of it away with deliberate care, placing each item into a single box that now lived beneath his bed. Sometimes late at night when Imani slept and the apartment grew quiet, he would think about that box. He never opened it. But he thought about it. Keisha had understood. She had always understood, without requiring explanation. She had been an emergency room nurse at Cook County Hospital, a woman who had witnessed enough trauma to recognize its marks in others, and she had loved him without ever trying to repair what she sensed was broken. She had let him remain silent when silence was what he needed. She had held him on nights when the dreams came screaming back. And when Imani was born, when he had held that tiny, screaming miracle in his arms for the first time, Keisha had looked at him and spoken words he would carry forever. "You're going to be the best father in the world, Darnell Braddock, because you understand what actually matters." Then she was gone too. A patch of black ice on the Kennedy Expressway, a truck driver who had been awake far too many hours, and a phone call at 3 a.m. that had shattered one life and fundamentally restructured another. Imani had been 3 years old. She barely remembered her mother, now retaining only fragments and sensory impressions, the smell of lavender lotion, and the melody of a particular lullaby. That evening, Darnell's mother arrived to discuss the travel arrangements. Lorraine Braddock was 65 years old, a retired elementary school teacher with silver hair and posture, suggesting she could still command a classroom of unruly children through sheer force of presence. She had relocated to Chicago from Detroit after her husband passed, wanting proximity to her son and granddaughter. She had become the third pillar of their small family structure, essential and irreplaceable. "You've got everything packed for the trip?" Darnell nodded toward the small suitcase positioned by the front door. 2 days. I'll be back Thursday night, and you'll call every evening while you're gone. Every evening, Mama. You know Imani won't sleep without hearing my voice." Lorraine studied him with the particular intensity that mothers never outgrow, regardless of how old their children become. "You look tired, baby." "I'm fine, Mama. You work too hard at that computer. I work exactly as hard as the situation requires." Lorraine made a sound conveying profound maternal skepticism, but chose not to pursue the matter further. She moved toward the kitchen to begin dinner preparation, and Darnell watched her go. This woman who had raised him alone after his father's death, who had worked double shifts to finance his education, who had never once allowed him to forget that he was capable of anything he could envision. Bedtime arrived. Darnell sat on the edge of Imani's bed with a worn copy of Charlotte's Web open in his hands. They were 3 chapters from the conclusion, and Imani had become deeply invested in Wilbur's fate. She fought sleep with the determination of a soldier defending strategic ground. her eyes fluttering closed, then snapping open in defiance, unwilling to surrender consciousness. "Daddy, do you promise you'll come back from your trip?" The question inserted itself between his ribs like a blade. Darnell set the book aside and looked directly at his daughter. "I promise, baby girl. I always come back to you. But what if something happens while you're gone? Nothing is going to happen. You can't know that for certain." "Daddy." Darnell reached out and brushed a strand of hair from Imani's forehead. His hand was steady, but something trembled in his chest. "You're right. I can't know the future. But I can promise you this. No matter what happens, no matter where I am in the world, I will always do everything in my power to come home to you. Because you are the most important thing in my entire world. You are bigger than the sky." Imani smiled as her eyes finally surrendered to sleep. Bigger than all the skies. Bigger than all the skies in the whole universe. He remained sitting on her bed for a long time after she fell asleep, watching the rise and fall of her breathing, listening to the sounds of Chicago traffic outside the window. Tomorrow, he would fly to London. A 3-day conference on logistics software, an opportunity to network with potential clients. A small step up the corporate ladder he had chosen to climb, instead of the one that had once seemed like destiny. He would sit in economy class because the company would not pay for business class, and he would read his paperback novel and eat the mediocre pasta and remain invisible to everyone around him. And everything would be fine. Later, lying in his own bed staring at the ceiling, Darnell's thoughts drifted despite his resistance toward the box beneath him. The medals, the photographs, the call sign that had once been painted in bold letters on the side of an F-16 Fighting Falcon. Ghost. He had earned that name in the skies over Afghanistan, flying night missions, appearing and vanishing before enemy forces understood he was present. 1,500 hours in the cockpit of the most demanding fighter aircraft ever manufactured. A distinguished flying cross for a night rescue mission that had saved 8 lives from certain death. The kind of military career that other pilots constructed monuments to celebrate. And then Maverick had died. Lieutenant Marcus Thompson, 26 years old, smart and eager and confident in the particular way that only young pilots can be confident before the sky teaches them humility. Darnell had mentored him for 2 years, had taught him everything about flying and fighting and surviving when physics and enemy fire both wanted you dead. They had flown together, eaten together, laughed at each other's terrible jokes together. And then one night, over the mountains of eastern Afghanistan, Maverick's aircraft had experienced a catastrophic flight control failure. The same failure that Darnell had formally reported on his own aircraft just 3 days earlier. The military had known about the software bug. Command had known. The maintenance logs documented the pattern with damning clarity. But grounding the fleet for repairs would have cost millions of dollars and delayed combat operations by weeks, and someone in an office far removed from the flight line had performed calculations and decided the risk was acceptable. The mathematics of bureaucracy. The cold calculus of acceptable losses. Maverick had become a statistic in someone else's spreadsheet. Darnell had held the young man's personal effects after the crash. A photograph of his girlfriend smiling on a beach. A letter to his mother that he had been meaning to mail for weeks. A challenge coin from their squadron worn smooth from years of handling. And in that moment, standing in the ready room surrounded by men who pretended not to see his tears, something fundamental had fractured inside Darnell Braddock. The faith that the institution he served would protect its own people. Keisha had died 3 months later. Different tragedy, same devastating year. And Darnell had looked at his 3-year-old daughter and made the choice that would define the rest of his existence. He would not continue flying for people who valued budget projections over human lives. He would not risk leaving Imani an orphan for an organization that had allowed Maverick to die through deliberate negligence. He would walk away from the sky and never look back. 4 years later, lying in his bed in Rogers Park, he could still hear Maverick's voice on the radio during those final moments. Still feel the helplessness of circling overhead, unable to do anything except watch and listen as his friend died. He closed his eyes and breathed deeply, forcing the memories back into the mental compartment where they belonged. Tomorrow, he would fly to London, not as a pilot, as a passenger, as a software engineer attending a corporate conference, as a single father who had made his choice and learned to carry its weight. Sleep eventually arrived dreamless and leaden. The alarm pulled him to consciousness at 5 a.m. Darnell moved through his pre-travel routine with military precision shower, shave dress in dark slacks, and the gray sweater that the conference dress code designated as business casual. He double-checked the suitcase contents. Laptop bag packed with computer charger, paperback novel folder of meeting documents. Imani was still sleeping when he entered her room for goodbye. He knelt beside her bed and whispered her name, and she stirred, eyes opening just enough to register his presence. "Daddy, you're leaving now." "Yes, baby girl. I'll be back Thursday night." She nodded, already sliding back toward sleep. "Love you bigger than the sky, bigger than all the skies." He kissed her forehead one final time and left the room, pulling the door closed with infinite care to avoid any sound that might fully wake her. Lorraine was in the kitchen preparing coffee, and she handed him a travel mug without requiring words. They embraced with the efficiency of long practice, and then Darnell was through the front door and walking toward the L station as dawn began to color the Chicago sky. O'Hare International Airport absorbed him into its currents. Security lines populated by half-awake travelers. Gate assignments displayed on flickering screens. The particular antiseptic smell of recycled air that all major airports share. Darnell found his terminal and claimed a seat near the windows, his laptop open, but ignored his mind wandering through territory he could not quite map. He pulled out his phone and recorded a voice message, something he had begun doing before every trip since Imani learned to operate the voicemail system. "Hey, baby girl, it's Daddy. I'm at the airport now, about to board the big plane to London. I'll call you tonight when I land, but I wanted you to have this message to listen to when you wake up. I hope you have a really great day at school. Be good for Grandma. Do your homework before you watch any TV. And remember, I love you bigger than the sky, bigger than all the skies in the whole universe. Talk to you soon, baby girl." He sent the message and pocketed the phone. The airport hummed with its characteristic music of announcements and footsteps and wheeled luggage. A businessman in an expensive suit walked past without acknowledging his existence. A flight attendant offered a professional smile that evaporated before it fully formed. Darnell Braddock sat invisible by the window and waited to board his flight. The Boeing 787 Dreamliner represented aviation engineering at its finest, composite fuselage reducing weight and increasing fuel efficiency. Reduced cabin pressure improving passenger comfort. Larger windows allowing more natural light. Darnell had read about these aircraft extensively, the engineer in him appreciating the technical achievements involved. He found his assigned seat in row 8, stowed his carry-on in the overhead compartment, and settled into the window position with movements refined by thousands of hours of air travel. The cabin filled gradually around him. Business travelers arranging laptops and neck pillows. Tourists clutching guidebooks and excitement. A family with 2 young children already negotiating loudly over window seat privileges. Darnell opened his novel and read the same paragraph 4 times without registering a single word. In the first-class cabin, separated from economy by a curtain and an entire universe of assumptions about human value, a man in a Ralph Lauren polo shirt accepted his first glass of bourbon from an attentive flight attendant. Richard Whitmore was 58 years old, chief executive officer of a commercial real estate development company headquartered in Connecticut. He had been flying first class for 30 years and had long ago stopped perceiving the people seated behind the curtain as individuals with stories and struggles and inherent worth. They existed in his peripheral awareness like furniture present but fundamentally uninteresting. The flight attendants performed their safety demonstrations with practiced choreography. Darnell watched without truly seeing. He knew these procedures by heart. He knew them in ways that most passengers could never imagine. But that knowledge belonged to another life, and he had sealed the door on it 4 years ago. The engines increased power. The aircraft began its taxi toward the active runway. Darnell watched through his window as Chicago fell away beneath them, the grid of familiar streets giving way to the dramatic curve of the lakeshore, giving way to the blue-gray vastness of Lake Michigan. Then there was only sky and cloud and the steady vibration of engines propelling them toward London at 500 miles per hour. He slept. The flight was overnight, 9 hours from Chicago to Heathrow, and Darnell had learned across countless deployments to sleep whenever opportunity presented itself. His body remembered the rhythms of long missions, the ability to grab rest in any position under any circumstances. The novel lay forgotten in the seat pocket. Hours passed unmarked, and then the aircraft shuddered. Darnell's eyes opened instantly. The movement had been subtle, barely perceptible to untrained senses, but his body recognized the wrongness before his conscious mind could articulate what it meant. Around him, most passengers remained asleep, faces slack, breathing steady. The cabin lights were dimmed to soft blue for the overnight crossing. Outside his window, there was only darkness. He checked his watch. 2:47 in the morning Chicago time. They were somewhere over the North Atlantic, suspended above that vast emptiness between continents, where the ocean stretched to every horizon and the nearest solid ground was hours away in any direction. The aircraft shuddered again. This time, several passengers stirred. Someone 3 rows back made a sound of concern. In the cockpit, Captain William Callahan was staring at his instrument panel with the focused intensity that came from 30 years of professional flying. Billy Callahan was 52 years old, an Air Force veteran who had transitioned to commercial aviation after his military service with 25,000 hours of flight time logged and more Atlantic crossings than he could accurately count. He had experienced turbulence. He had managed mechanical failures. He had navigated storms that made experienced pilots pray. He had never encountered anything quite like this. The primary flight control computer had failed 12 minutes ago. Callahan had followed the checklist procedures meticulously, had reset the system, had done everything the manufacturer recommended. Now the secondary computer was displaying warnings that defied logical explanation. Yellow caution lights illuminated where green status indicators should have been. Error codes scrolled across screens suggesting something fundamentally wrong with how the aircraft was communicating with itself. Derek. I'm going to check the circuit breaker panel. You have control of the aircraft. First Officer Derek Holloway was 31 years old, a competent pilot who had upgraded to the 7 in 87 type rating 18 months earlier. His wife Jenna was 8 months pregnant with their first child, a fact he had mentioned to Callahan during their pre-flight briefing with obvious pride. He had never handled an emergency of this magnitude outside the controlled environment of a simulator. I have the aircraft captain. Callahan unbuckled his harness and stood turning toward the circuit breaker panel mounted behind his seat. The aircraft was flying smoothly for the moment, the autopilot maintaining their assigned altitude and heading, but the warnings on the instrument panel were multiplying like cells dividing. Something was cascading through the system architecture, and Callahan could not identify the source. He never got the opportunity. The clear air turbulence struck without warning. No radar return. No visual indication. No atmospheric cues. Simply calm sky one moment and violent atmospheric chaos the next. The aircraft dropped 200 feet in approximately 3 seconds, the kind of sudden vertical displacement that transforms unsecured objects into projectiles and throws standing humans against the nearest hard surface. Captain Callahan's head struck the overhead instrument panel with a sound like a cantaloupe dropped onto concrete. He collapsed to the cockpit floor, blood streaming from a deep gash above his right eye, his body motionless. In the main cabin, chaos erupted. Passengers screamed. Overhead compartments burst open explosively, spilling luggage into the aisles. Flight attendants who had been seated for the overnight cruise struggled to regain their footing. Emergency lights flickered uncertainly before stabilizing, and through all of it, the aircraft continued to fly, its wounded computers struggling to maintain some semblance of control. Darnell Braddock was already in motion before his conscious mind fully processed the situation. Not toward the exits, not toward panic. He moved the way a man moves when every second carries weight measured in lives, unbuckling his seatbelt and rising into a controlled crouch, his eyes scanning the cabin for immediate threats. This was muscle memory, 4 years dormant but never truly forgotten. The assessment was automatic, a checklist burned into his neural pathways by thousands of hours of training. Fire risk, none visible. Structural damage. No sounds indicating hull breach. Passengers. Frightened but physically intact. Aircraft attitude. Nose pitched slightly down left wing, dropping below level. That final observation was the critical one. The aircraft was flying, but it was not flying correctly. Darnell could feel the wrongness in the subtle vibrations transmitted through the floor, in the way the engine note had shifted frequency in a constellation of small indicators that most passengers would never consciously notice, but that screamed alarm to his trained senses. Something was fundamentally wrong with the flight control system. The seatbelt sign was flashing. The oxygen masks had not deployed, which meant no cabin decompression. This was not a structural emergency. This was something else entirely. A flight attendant was moving down the aisle, her face professionally composed, despite the fear visible in her eyes. Nadine Foster was 28 years old, 5 years into her aviation career, and she had never experienced anything remotely like this situation. She was helping passengers back into their seats, checking for injuries, executing her training with determined competence. The intercom system crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your first officer speaking." Derek Holloway's voice was wrong. Darnell recognized that specific wrongness immediately. He had heard it before in young pilots facing situations that exceeded their training and experience, the careful surface control barely masking an edge of panic, the slight tremor on certain consonants. "We have experienced some unexpected turbulence. The captain has been injured and is receiving medical attention. The situation is under control. Please remain seated with your seatbelts securely fastened." The announcement ended. Around Darnell, passengers exchanged frightened glances. Some were crying openly. Some were praying in whispers. Some were already reaching for mobile phones as if cellular service existed over the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Darnell remained motionless in his seat. He was listening, not to the passengers, to the aircraft itself. The engines were running within normal parameters. He could identify that from the pitch and rhythm of their sound. The hydraulic systems appeared to be functioning. He could sense that in the smooth operation of the control surfaces visible through his window. But something was profoundly wrong with the fly-by-wire system. The aircraft was making constant small corrections, tiny adjustments that should have been smooth and seamless, but instead they were jerky and hesitant, like a brain trying to send signals through damaged nerve pathways. He understood what that pattern meant. He had witnessed it before. 3 minutes elapsed. The cabin remained tense, but quiet, passengers waiting for information that might never come. Nadine Foster continued her circuit through the aisles, checking on passengers, dispensing reassurances she almost certainly did not feel herself. In first class, Richard Whitmore had ordered another bourbon and was complaining audibly about the inconvenience to anyone within earshot. The family with young children had managed to calm their frightened kids into exhausted silence. The intercom crackled again. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your first officer. I need to provide you with more specific information about our situation." Derek Holloway's voice had changed. The professional veneer was cracking. The panic was closer to the surface, threatening to break through. "We have experienced a critical malfunction in our flight control computer systems. The captain is unconscious and receiving emergency medical care. At this time, I am requesting assistance from passengers. If anyone on board this aircraft has experience flying aircraft manually, particularly military aviation or combat aircraft experience. Please identify yourself to the cabin crew immediately. Time is critical. The words hung in the recycled cabin air like physical objects. For a stretched moment, no one moved. Passengers looked at each other with expressions of dawning horror as the implications of the announcement became clear. The aircraft was in serious trouble. The captain was incapacitated, and the first officer was asking passengers for help. Then Gerald Pritchard stood up. He was 54 years old, a successful dentist from Connecticut, a proud member of the local flying club with 200 hours logged in a Cessna 172. He had been waiting his entire life for a moment like this, an opportunity to be the hero, a chance to prove that all those weekend flights over the New England coastline had prepared him for something greater than recreational aviation. I'm a pilot. Private pilot, fully licensed and current. I can help with this situation. Nadine Foster hurried toward him. She listened attentively as Pritchard explained his credentials, his accumulated hours, his experience. Hope flickered visibly across her face. This man knew how to fly aircraft. This man could help save them. She relayed the information to the cockpit via interphone. There was a pause that stretched uncomfortably long. Then Derek Holloway's voice returned defeated and apologetic. I'm sorry, sir. We genuinely appreciate you coming forward. But the situation requires much more specialized experience than private pilot certification. Pritchard sat down heavily in his seat, his moment of anticipated glory evaporating like morning dew. The hope that had briefly illuminated the cabin died with his deflation. If a licensed pilot could not help, what possible chance did any of them have? Darnell Braddock sat in seat 8A and wrestled with the decision that circumstances had suddenly placed before him. He knew exactly what was happening to this aircraft. He knew because he had witnessed the identical failure pattern before in the mountains of Afghanistan, in the final desperate radio transmissions of a young pilot named Maverick, who had died because some bureaucrat had decided that fixing a software bug cost more than a human life was worth. The cascading flight control failure, the computers disagreeing with each other, corrupting each other's data, failing in sequence. It was the nightmare scenario for any fly-by-wire aircraft, the thing that engineers insisted could never happen, but that happened anyway when maintenance was deferred and warnings were ignored. There was only one way to survive it: manual reversion, bypassing the primary flight computers entirely. Flying the aircraft on the backup mechanical system that most civilian pilots had never been trained to use because the training was deemed unnecessary for equipment that was supposed to be infallible. Darnell had trained for it. 1,500 hours in an F-16 Fighting Falcon, the most demanding fly-by-wire aircraft ever built for combat operations. He had practiced manual reversion procedures until they were as natural as breathing. He understood how to fly when the computers failed because the computers in high-performance fighter jets failed more frequently than the Air Force publicly acknowledged. But that was 4 years ago. 4 years since he had touched a yoke or a control stick. 4 years since he had sealed that door and walked away from everything it represented. He was a software engineer now, a single father, a man who had promised his daughter he would always come home to her. He thought about Imani, about the voice message he had recorded for her that morning, the one she would listen to when she woke up expecting an ordinary day, about the way she said "bigger than all the skies" with that gap-toothed smile illuminating her entire face, about what it would mean for her if he did nothing, and this aircraft dropped out of the sky into the black Atlantic below. 242 people were on this flight. Mothers and fathers, sons and daughters, human beings with families who loved them, with lives that mattered, with promises they had made to people who were waiting for them to arrive safely. Darnell unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up. The movement immediately drew attention. Heads throughout the cabin turned toward him. Eyes found and assessed him. A black man in a wrinkled gray sweater standing in the aisle of an aircraft that might be dying. Nothing about his appearance suggested capability. Nothing about his presentation suggested Expertise. He looked exactly like what the passenger manifest said. He was a software engineer from Chicago who had been assigned to seat 8A in economy class. I can help with this situation. I'm a former military pilot, United States Air Force, 1,500 hours in F-16. Fighting Falcons. I've dealt with flight control failures before. The words fell into absolute silence. Nobody moved. Darnell felt the weight of every stare pressing against him, the assessment happening in real time throughout the cabin. The evaluations that had nothing to do with his words and everything to do with other factors. The wrinkled sweater, the worn jeans, the economy class seat assignment, the color of his skin. Somewhere behind him, a voice whispered loudly enough to carry, "He doesn't look like any pilot I've ever seen." Darnell did not turn around to identify the speaker. He had heard variations of that sentence throughout his entire life. In the Air Force, where he had been one of the only black pilots in his squadron. In the corporate world, where he was frequently the only person of color in meeting rooms. In retail stores, where security personnel followed him with suspicious eyes. He had learned to let such words pass through him without leaving marks to prove himself through action rather than argument, to demonstrate capability rather than debate assumptions. Nadine Foster approached him with visible caution. Her eyes held skepticism and desperate hope in roughly equal proportions. "Sir, do you have any credentials you can show us?" "Military identification or a pilot's license?" "No." Darnell kept his voice calm and measured. "I separated from the Air Force 4 years ago. I don't carry military credentials in civilian life." Nadine hesitated. "Then how can we possibly verify?" Darnell interrupted her not rudely, but with the precise efficiency of a man who had briefed countless combat missions under time pressure. "The aircraft is experiencing a cascading flight control computer failure. Based on what the first officer just announced, you've lost at least 2 of your 3 redundant flight control computers. The fly-by-wire system is degrading, which means your pilots are rapidly running out of options. If the 3rd computer fails completely, you'll have no electronic flight control capability whatsoever. Your only chance for survival is manual reversion to the standby flight control module, which requires specific training that civilian airline pilots do not receive." Nadine's face went pale. She did not understand every technical detail he had just provided, but she understood enough. This man knew things he should not be able to know unless he was exactly who he claimed to be. From the business class section, a woman stood up. Dr. Margaret Sullivan was 47 years old, a cardiologist at Johns Hopkins University Hospital, traveling to London for a medical conference. She had spent her career reading people in crisis situations, assessing them in moments when accurate judgment meant the difference between life and death. "I've been listening carefully to this man's assessment of our situation. I know nothing whatsoever about aviation, but I know how trained professionals respond under pressure. He's not panicking. He's not seeking attention. He's systematically analyzing the situation and providing specific technical information. That's what experts do. That's what training produces." Her words shifted something in the cabin atmosphere. Heads nodded. The whispered conversations changed their tone, but it was not sufficient. Standing in the aisle near the front of the cabin, physically blocking the path to the cockpit, was a man who had spent 30 years in the United States Navy and had no intention of allowing anyone through without proper verification. Colonel Theodore Crawford was 67 years old, retired after a distinguished naval career that had taken him from the flight decks of aircraft carriers to command of the USS Enterprise. He had iron-gray hair posture suggesting a spine constructed from structural steel and eyes capable of making subordinates confess to sins they had not yet committed. "I'm not letting anyone near that cockpit without verification." His voice carried the absolute authority of 3 decades in command. "I'm Navy retired, 30 years of service. I know what real military bearing looks like, and I know what pretenders look like." Darnell met his gaze without flinching. 2 veterans facing each other across a gulf of different service branches and different generations and vastly different circumstances. Air Force and Navy. fighter pilot and ship commander. Black and white. Then test me. The two words were simple, direct, challenging. Crawford's eyes narrowed. For a long moment that stretched like taffy, neither man moved or spoke. Then Crawford began his examination. Standard procedure for manual reversion in a flight control failure situation. Darnell answered without hesitation. Depends entirely on the specific aircraft type. In an F-16, you engage the standby flight control system through the FLCS panel, then verify hydraulic pressure and control stick response before attempting any maneuvering. In a commercial fly-by-wire aircraft like this 787, the process differs, but the underlying principle remains the same. You're bypassing the primary computers and routing control inputs through a simplified backup system with reduced authority. Minimum safe airspeed for controlled flight in a 787 with degraded flight control systems. Clean configuration, approximately 200 knots indicated airspeed. But if we've lost flight computers, we won't have reliable airspeed readings from the pitot system either. So you fly by pitch, attitude, power setting, and seat of the pants feel instead of trusting the instruments. Crawford's questions accelerated. GLOU recognition and recovery procedure. G-induced loss of consciousness occurs during aggressive maneuvering when blood drains from the brain faster than the heart can compensate. Recovery depends entirely on available altitude. If you have altitude to spare, you unload the aircraft to 0G and allow blood flow to return to the brain. If you don't have altitude, you impact terrain. Darnell paused briefly, but that particular emergency isn't relevant to our current situation. This is a passenger aircraft, not a fighter jet. The cabin had fallen into absolute silence. 242 people held their breath collectively. Crawford studied Darnell for a long moment with those penetrating naval commander's eyes. Something fundamental shifted in the older man's expression. Not quite trust, something closer to recognition. One professional acknowledging another across the barriers that had initially separated them. "He's real." Crawford stepped aside from the aisle. "Get him to that cockpit." Darnell moved forward toward the cockpit door. Behind him, he could feel the weight of every stair in the cabin, the transformation from doubt to desperate hope. He was still the man in the wrinkled sweater, the man from seat 8A, the man nobody had noticed or considered. But now they were noticing. Now they were betting their lives on him. As he passed Crawford, the old colonel spoke quietly enough that only Darnell could hear the words. "Good luck up there, and I apologize." Darnell understood immediately. The apology was not for the test. It was for the assumption that had made the test necessary in the first place. "Thank you, Colonel." The cockpit door opened, and Darnell stepped through into the cramped space where the fate of 242 souls would be determined. The scene inside was worse than anything he had imagined. Half the instrument displays were dark or flickering with cascading error codes. The smell of overheated electronics hung thick in the recycled air. Captain Callahan lay slumped awkwardly in the left seat, a flight attendant pressing a blood-soaked cloth against the gash on his forehead. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow and irregular. And in the right seat, hands white-knuckled on the control yoke. First Officer Derek Holloway looked up with the expression of a drowning man who had just spotted a hand reaching down toward him through the water. "Oh, thank God you're here. The computers are failing one after another. I don't know how to stop the cascade. I've never done anything like this outside of a simulator." Darnell moved toward the captain's seat, his eyes already scanning the instrument panel with practiced efficiency. The pattern was unmistakable, clear as a signature to anyone trained to read it. Computer 2 had failed first. Computer 1 had followed within minutes. Computer 3 was degraded and declining rapidly, its indicator lights flashing yellow with increasing frequency. He knew this pattern. He had seen it documented in the maintenance logs that had been ignored by commanders more concerned with operational schedules than pilot safety. He had seen it in the classified investigation report that had been buried to protect institutional reputations. He had seen it in the final terrified moments of Maverick's life. "I'm going to take the captain's seat." Darnell's voice carried the calm authority of a man who had led combat missions into hostile territory. "You're going to talk me through the 787 specific systems while I fly this aircraft. We're going to work together as a team, one problem at a time." Holloway nodded, some of the paralyzing panic draining visibly from his face. "Okay. Yes. Okay." Darnell settled into the captain's seat and placed his hands on the control yoke. The feel of it was different from a fighter's side stick controller. Heavier, more substantial, designed for a different kind of flying. But the underlying principles remained constant. The physics remained identical. Fly the aircraft, maintain control, stay alive. He glanced at Captain Callahan, unconscious and bleeding in the jump seat where the flight attendant had moved him. Recognition flickered through Darnell's memory. The man's face was somehow familiar. Something about the line of his jaw, the silver hair, an old scar on his chin. Then the memory surfaced complete. Afghanistan. The night rescue mission. A helicopter pilot who had been shot down behind enemy lines and extracted on foot, while Darnell flew cover overhead. Callahan had been one of the 8 men whose lives Darnell had helped save that night. He had never seen the man's face clearly in the darkness and chaos. He had only heard his voice over the radio, desperate and grateful. "Ghost, this is Rescue 7. We're taking heavy fire. We need you. Billy Callahan." The man Darnell had saved 8 years ago was now unconscious beside him, and Darnell was the only person who could save him again. The universe apparently possessed a peculiar sense of humor. Computer 3's status light flickered from yellow to red. Darnell pushed the memories aside with practiced discipline. There was no time for the past. There was only this moment, this aircraft, these 242 souls depending on him. "What's our current position?" Holloway checked the navigation display with shaking hands. 60 degrees north latitude, 32 degrees west longitude, approximately 400 nautical miles from Iceland. Fuel status, adequate for multiple diversion options if we can maintain controlled flight. Hydraulic systems. Holloway's voice faltered as he studied the gauges. "Still showing green, but the pressure is decreasing. Slowly, but it's definitely decreasing." Darnell absorbed this additional complication. The cascade was continuing its destructive progression through the aircraft's systems. The software bug was propagating like a cancer, corrupting each computer in sequence. When Computer 3 failed completely, they would have no electronic flight control remaining, no autopilot, no stability augmentation, just raw hydraulic power and a backup system that had never been adequately tested under real emergency conditions. He had seen this exact scenario before. 4 years ago, in the mountains of Afghanistan. The same pattern, the same cascade, the same nightmare. Maverick had died because someone decided that fixing the bug would cost too much money and take too much time. But Darnell Braddock was not Maverick. Darnell Braddock had survived the night rescue in Afghanistan and the devastating loss of his wife and 4 years of single fatherhood, and every assumption that had ever been made about who he was and what he could accomplish. He had survived because he refused to let circumstances define his limits. And he was going to survive this. The cockpit door cracked open behind him. Nadine Foster's face appeared in the gap. "Sir, we have another emergency developing in the cabin. An elderly passenger is experiencing severe chest pains. Dr. Sullivan believes it might be a heart attack." Darnell did not turn from the instruments. "Get the doctor working on him. She'll know what to do until we can get this aircraft on the ground." The door closed. Another weight added to the scale, another life hanging in the balance of his decisions. But Darnell could not afford to think about that now. He had one job: fly the aircraft, keep it in the sky, get these people to solid ground alive. Everything else would have to wait. "Talk to me about the manual reversion procedure specific to this aircraft type." Holloway blinked, struggling to shift mental gears from panic to procedure. It's in the emergency checklist. We engage the standby flight control module through the overhead panel. But in training, they told us there's a gap during the transition. A few seconds where the primary system disconnects before the standby system fully engages. Darnell nodded grimly. 3 seconds. For 3 seconds, we'll have no computer assistance with flight control. The aircraft will respond purely to physics and aerodynamics. Any gusts, any turbulence, any asymmetric thrust will translate directly into aircraft motion without electronic dampening. That's absolutely terrifying. That's the reality of our situation. The question is whether we wait until Computer 3 fails completely and the transition happens outside our control, or we execute the transition now, while we still have options to manage it. The logic was irrefutable. Holloway could see that clearly despite his fear. My wife is 8 months pregnant. His voice cracked slightly. We don't know yet if it's a boy or a girl. We wanted to be surprised. Darnell looked at the young pilot, at this man barely into his 30s, who had found himself thrust into a situation that would test pilots with decades more experience. His voice softened, but his resolve did not waver. Then we both have very good reasons to land this aircraft safely. Your child needs a father. My daughter needs me to come home. We're going to make both of those things happen. Together, Holloway took a deep breath, nodded once with new determination. What do you need me to do? And 4,000 miles to the west in a small apartment in Rogers Park. A 7-year-old girl jerked awake from troubled sleep and reached through the darkness for her grandmother's hand. Grandma, I had a really bad dream about Daddy. Lorraine Braddock pulled her granddaughter close against her chest. It's okay, baby. It was just a dream. Your daddy is fine. He's on his way to London for his work conference. But Imani shook her head, her eyes wide with a fear she could not articulate or explain. Something's wrong, Grandma. I can feel it. Something's really wrong. Outside the window, the first gray light of dawn was beginning to touch the Chicago skyline. A normal morning, beginning in a normal city. But somewhere over the vast darkness of the Atlantic Ocean, Imani's father was fighting for his life and the lives of 241 strangers. And everything they knew was about to change. The television in Lorraine Braddock's living room flickered to life at 4:17 in the morning, casting dancing blue shadows across furniture that had occupied the same positions for 2 decades. She had turned it on from reflex the way people do when sleep refuses to come and silence becomes oppressive. She had expected infomercials or late-night talk shows or weather forecasts, the comfortable background noise of a world continuing its ordinary business. Instead, she found a red breaking news banner and a reporter speaking with the controlled urgency that broadcast professionals reserve for genuine catastrophe. Atlantic Airways Flight 447 traveling from Chicago to London has declared an emergency over the North Atlantic Ocean. The Boeing 787 Dreamliner, carrying approximately 240 passengers and crew members, reported critical systems failures roughly 3 hours into the overnight flight. Contact with the aircraft has been intermittent due to atmospheric interference. Aviation authorities are monitoring the situation closely. We will bring you updates as they become available. Lorraine's hand found the arm of her chair and gripped it until her knuckles turned white. Chicago to London. That was Darnell's flight. That was her son. Her only child. The boy she had raised alone after Marcus Sr. died of a heart attack at 43, the man who had given her a granddaughter who was currently sleeping in the next room. The reporter continued speaking, but the words dissolved into meaningless noise. There was only the roaring of blood in Lorraine's ears, the accelerated pounding of her heart, the terrible probability calculations running automatically through her mind. How many flights departed Chicago for London every day? How many Boeing 787s crossed the Atlantic on any given night? What were the statistical chances that this particular emergency on this particular aircraft involved her son? She knew the answer before she completed the calculation. Mothers always know. The bedroom door opened and Imani appeared in the doorway, her face puffy from sleep, the 2 puffs of her hair slightly disheveled from restless tossing. She stood there in her dinosaur pajamas, the ones with the T-Rex playing basketball, and she looked at her grandmother with eyes that contained knowledge no 7-year-old should possess. "It's Daddy's plane, isn't it, Grandma?" Not a question. A statement of fact, delivered with terrible certainty. Lorraine opened her arms, and Imani crossed the room without hesitation and climbed into her grandmother's lap, and they held each other, while the television displayed stock footage of Boeing 787s taking off and landing at various airports, generic images that provided no information about the specific nightmare unfolding. Somewhere over the dark ocean. "Grandma, is Daddy going to be okay?" Lorraine closed her eyes and drew her granddaughter closer. She thought about all the times across the years when she had answered this same question with confident reassurances. When Darnell was flying combat missions in Afghanistan and she waited by the phone for calls that sometimes did not come for days. When Keisha first got sick and then seemed to recover and then did not recover at all. When the world appeared determined to take everyone she loved and she had to find words to comfort a child too young to understand mortality, but old enough to sense its shadow. "Your daddy is the strongest, smartest man I have ever known." She pulled Imani tighter. "Whatever is happening up there right now, he will find a way through it. He always finds a way. He always comes home." But even as she spoke the words aloud, Lorraine was praying silently. Praying to a God she had sometimes struggled to believe in a voice that was more desperate than faithful. More plea than praise. "Bring my son home. Please. Bring him back to this little girl who loves him bigger than all the skies." In the first-class cabin of Atlantic Airways Flight 447, Richard Whitmore was not praying. He was drinking. His fourth bourbon sat half-finished on the tray table before him. The ice long since melted the liquid warm and bitter on his tongue. Around him in the premium cabin, other passengers wept or prayed or sat in stunned silence, processing their potential mortality. But Richard Whitmore had never been comfortable with emotional vulnerability. He had constructed a career on the projection of absolute control, and the sudden loss of that control felt like a personal insult from the universe. The curtain separating first class from business class rippled slightly, and through the gap, Richard caught a glimpse of the man walking toward the cockpit. The man in the wrinkled sweater. The man from economy class. The man everyone had doubted. Something hot and uncomfortable stirred in Richard's chest. He did not name it. He did not examine it. He had spent 58 years refusing to name or examine the things that lived in the shadowed corners of his conscience. Instead, he reached for his bourbon and took another long swallow. Richard Whitmore was not a racist. He was absolutely certain of this foundational truth about himself. He donated generously to organizations supporting diversity in corporate America. He had consistently voted for candidates who championed civil rights legislation. His daughter Sarah had married a black man, a cardiothoracic surgeon at Mount Sinai Hospital, and Richard adored their son Marcus, with the uncomplicated love of a grandfather who saw only a wonderful child, not a racial category. He reminded himself of these facts, often cataloging them like exhibits in an ongoing defense of his character. But when the man in the wrinkled sweater had stood up in the economy cabin and claimed to be a military pilot capable of saving them, something in Richard's brain had fired an instinctive warning signal. Not the words. The words had been technically convincing. It was something else. Something in the man's appearance. The casual clothing. The economy class seat assignment. The confidence that seemed somehow misplaced given his obvious circumstances. Richard's brain had processed all of these inputs through filters he did not consciously acknowledge and reached an immediate conclusion. This man cannot possibly be qualified for what he claims. Richard had not voiced this assessment aloud. He was far too sophisticated and self-aware for such obvious impropriety, but he had thought it clearly and distinctly, and now sitting in first class while that same man presumably flew the aircraft toward survival or disaster, Richard was being forced to confront the hidden architecture of his own assumptions. Would he have felt identical skepticism if the man had been white, if he had been wearing business attire, if he had been seated in first class rather than economy? The bourbon burned going down his throat. Richard did not want to answer these questions honestly. He had spent a lifetime constructing walls against exactly this variety of uncomfortable self-examination. But those walls were crumbling now, and something ugly was seeping through the cracks. His grandson Marcus was 7 years old, exactly the same age Richard suddenly realized with sharp clarity as the daughter the man in the cockpit had mentioned. If someone looked at Marcus and made instant assumptions based on the color of his skin, Richard would have been furious. He would have demanded accountability. He would have written letters and made phone calls and leveraged every connection he possessed to right the perceived wrong. And yet here he sat having done exactly that to a stranger, having judged and dismissed and doubted without any evidence beyond appearance and circumstance, having demonstrated in the privacy of his own thoughts the precise prejudice he insisted he did not possess. The aircraft shuddered slightly beneath him, and Richard's hand tightened convulsively on his glass. Somewhere in that cockpit, the man he had internally dismissed was trying to save everyone's life. The bitter irony was impossible to ignore. If they survived this night, their survival would be entirely due to the competence of the very person Richard's instincts had instructed him to distrust. He finished the bourbon in a single swallow and set down the empty glass. For the first time in many years, Richard Whitmore felt something that might have been genuine shame. In the cockpit, Darnell was far too focused on the cascading emergency to spare any thought for the doubters in the cabin behind him. The instrument panel demanded every fraction of his attention, its warnings and error codes telling a story of systematic failure that he understood all too well from his military experience. Walk me through the hydraulic system architecture. Derek Holloway blinked the technical question, pulling him back from the precipice of overwhelming panic. The 787 utilizes 3 independent hydraulic systems, left, right, and center. Each system can operate the primary flight control surfaces independently of the others. And if we lose all 3 systems, there's a ram air turbine that deploys automatically. It drops from the fuselage and uses airflow to generate enough hydraulic and electrical power for basic flight control and a single landing attempt. Darnell filed this information away in his mental emergency procedures database. Fighter jets did not have ram air turbines. They had ejection seats instead. Different philosophy of survival. But the underlying principle was identical. Redundancy upon redundancy backup systems for the backup systems, because the engineers who designed these machines understood that the sky was perpetually trying to kill the people who dared to fly through it. Try the radio again. All frequencies. Derek keyed the microphone with trembling hands. Gander Oceanic Control, Atlantic 447. Emergency aircraft. Do you read over? Static. The distinctive hiss and crackle of electromagnetic interference that meant their transmissions were going nowhere. Shanwick Oceanic Atlantic 447. We are declaring an emergency. Request immediate assistance. Over. Nothing but static. The solar storm that meteorologists had been predicting for weeks was doing precisely what the scientists had warned it would do. The ionosphere was disturbed by charged particles streaming from the sun, the normal pathways for high-frequency radio communication thoroughly disrupted. They were alone in the sky, invisible to the ground controllers who should have been guiding them toward safety. Darnell had experienced radio blackouts before in combat situations, when enemy electronic warfare systems filled every frequency with noise and static. The profound loneliness of that silence was familiar to him. The critical difference was that in combat he had been flying alone in a single-seat fighter. Now he had 242 lives depending entirely on his decisions, and no one on the ground even knew where they were or what was happening. We're completely on our own out here." His voice remained calm, almost conversational in its steadiness. "Until we get close enough to land-based facilities for VHF radio range, no one can help us. No one even knows we need help." Derek's face went visibly pale in the dim cockpit lighting. "That's potentially hours away." "Yes, it is." The single-word acknowledgement hung suspended in the air between them. Hours of flying a critically damaged aircraft over the ocean with no communication capability, no external assistance, no margin for error whatsoever. Hours of monitoring the hydraulic pressure as it slowly bled away, while they calculated and recalculated whether they had sufficient reserves to reach any suitable landing site. The cockpit door cracked open, and Nadine Foster's face appeared in the gap, her expression taut with barely controlled fear. "Sir, the medical situation in the cabin is deteriorating. The elderly gentleman with chest pains, Dr. Sullivan, says it's definitely a cardiac event. She's doing what she can with limited supplies, but she says he needs a hospital soon." Darnell kept his eyes fixed on the instruments. "Tell her we're working on solutions. That's all I can say right now." The door closed softly behind her. Another weight added to an already overloaded scale. Another life hanging in the balance of every decision he made. But Darnell could not allow himself to think about that additional pressure. He had one job in this moment: fly the aircraft, maintain controlled flight, get everyone to solid ground while they were still alive. Everything else would have to wait its turn. "Walk me through the complete manual reversion procedure for the 787. Derek's hands moved to the electronic flight bag mounted beside his seat. "Standby flight control engagement checklist. Step 1. Verify status of all primary flight control computers. Computer 1 failed. Computer 2 failed. Computer 3 degraded and continuing to deteriorate. Step 2. Confirm hydraulic pressure is within acceptable limits for standby system operation. 53% on all 3 systems, marginal but within acceptable parameters. Step 3. Reduce thrust to flight idle and stabilize the aircraft in level flight attitude." Darnell's hands moved on the throttles, easing them back with precise control until the engines were producing just enough thrust to maintain their current altitude. The aircraft settled into stable flight, its pitch stabilizing, its wings leveling. Outside the windscreen, there was nothing visible but absolute darkness. No stars, no moon, just the endless black void of the Atlantic night. Step 4. Arm the standby flight control module for engagement. Darnell reached for the overhead panel. His fingers found the switch, a small toggle protected by a plastic guard designed to prevent accidental activation. He flipped open the guard but did not touch the switch itself. "Not yet." Step 5. When ready, engage the standby module and prepare for momentary loss of control authority. Derek's voice cracked noticeably on those final words. Momentary loss of control authority. Such a clinical antiseptic phrase to describe 3 seconds when they would become passengers in their own aircraft, completely subject to the random whims of physics and atmospheric conditions. Darnell drew a deep breath. He thought about Imani, about the voice message he had recorded for her, about the promise he had made to always come home. He thought about Keisha watching from wherever she existed, now still believing in him the way she had always believed. He thought about Maverick, the young pilot who had never gotten the chance to prove what he could have become, who had died because someone in an office had decided his life was worth less than a budget line item. Not today. Not these people. Not while I'm still breathing. His fingers found the switch. Engaging standby flight control now. He flipped it. For one heartbeat, nothing perceptible changed. The aircraft continued flying stable and steady, its damaged computers still transmitting control commands to the flight surfaces. Then the connection severed. The yoke went completely limp in Darnell's hands. The resistance vanished entirely. The aircraft was now flying itself, responding to nothing except the immutable laws of physics and the current state of the atmosphere surrounding it. 1 second. The nose began to drop. Not dramatically, just a gentle pitch forward as natural aerodynamic forces took over without electronic correction. 2 seconds. The left wing dipped unexpectedly. An invisible gust of wind had caught the aircraft asymmetrically. The bank angle increased steadily, 5 degrees, then 8, then 10. The altimeter showed them descending, losing altitude, sliding toward the dark ocean far below. 3 seconds. The yoke stiffened in Darnell's hands. The standby system had engaged its simpler mechanical architecture, taking over from the failed primary computers. Darnell pulled back firmly, felt the elevator surfaces respond, felt the nose begin to rise. He corrected the bank angle, leveling the wings, arresting their descent with smooth, coordinated inputs. 150 feet. They had lost 150 feet of altitude in 3 seconds. "It's working." Derek's voice emerged as barely a whisper. "The standby system is responding. It's actually working." Darnell did not respond. He was entirely focused on flying. The controls felt dramatically different, now heavier and slower to respond than before. The refined finesse that the primary computer system had provided was completely gone. This was raw mechanical flying, demanding and unforgiving, the kind of flying he had not performed since leaving the Air Force. But his hands remembered. His muscles remembered. 4 years of civilian life had not erased the thousands of hours he had invested in learning to fly by pure feel, to trust his instincts completely, to translate the aircraft's subtle physical signals into the precise inputs required to keep it safely in the sky. "We have a new problem developing." Derek's voice cut through his concentration. "Hydraulic pressure just dropped another 8% across all systems." Darnell glanced at the gauges. 45%. The rate of pressure loss had increased significantly, either as a consequence of the system transition or because something else had failed in the cascade. They were hemorrhaging hydraulic fluid from somewhere, and they had no means of stopping the leak. "How long until we reach minimum safe pressure for controlled flight?" Derek worked through the calculations on his kneeboard. "At the current rate of loss, approximately 45 minutes. Maybe less. And our closest suitable diversion airport, Keflavik, Iceland, approximately 55 minutes at our current speed and altitude." The mathematics were brutally unfavorable. They would run out of hydraulic pressure before reaching the runway, unless they found another option. "Is there any landing facility closer than Keflavik?" Derek checked the navigation display. "Greenland has several possibilities. There are military installations with runways. Not suitable." Darnell shook his head without looking away from the instruments. "Those runways are too short for an aircraft this size, and the terrain makes the approaches extremely dangerous. We need a full-length runway with proper instrument approach procedures. Then Keflavik is our only realistic option." "What's Keflavik's current status? Can we reach them on VHF yet?" Derek tried the radio with renewed urgency. "Keflavik Tower, Atlantic 447. Emergency aircraft. Do you read over?" For an extended moment, nothing but static filled the cockpit speakers. Then, faint but unmistakable, a human voice broke through the interference. "Atlantic 447, this is Keflavik Tower. We are receiving you weak but clear. We understand you are an emergency aircraft. Please state the nature of your emergency." "Over." Relief flooded through the cockpit like oxygen returning to an airless room. They were no longer alone. "Keflavik Tower, Atlantic 447. We have experienced cascading flight control computer failure. We are currently operating on standby flight control systems with degraded hydraulics. Current hydraulic pressure is 43% and continuing to decline. We have approximately 242 souls on board, including a medical emergency requiring immediate hospital transport upon landing. We are requesting priority handling and full emergency equipment deployment." "Over." There was a pause while the controller absorbed and processed this dire information. "Atlantic 447, Keflavik Tower. We understand your emergency. Be advised current weather conditions at Keflavik are below standard minimums." Ceiling 800 feet, overcast visibility, 3 statute miles in light snow, wind from 250 degrees at 25 knots gusting to 40. We are recommending alternate Shannon, Ireland for all transatlantic traffic. Over. Darnell keyed the microphone. Negative on Shannon diversion. We do not have sufficient hydraulic capacity to reach Shannon. Keflavik is our only survivable option. Request current runway conditions and emergency services status. Over. Another pause. Atlantic 447 runway 31 is currently available. Runway length is 10,000 feet. Emergency services are being deployed to positions now. Be advised, sir, current conditions are marginal for a normal approach. With your degraded hydraulic systems, this will be extremely challenging. Over. Understood, Keflavik. We're coming regardless. Clear the runway and have fire and rescue standing by for our arrival. He released the microphone button and turned to Derek. Set up everything we need for the approach. I need all the approach plates' terrain information, everything available in the database for Keflavik. Derek's expression showed concern. You've never flown an approach into Keflavik before. I've never flown a 787 before tonight. Darnell allowed himself a grim approximation of a smile. I'm improvising as we go. Derek's hands moved rapidly across the electronic flight bag, pulling up charts and procedures and diagrams from the navigation database. Darnell absorbed the critical information in quick, focused glances, building a three-dimensional mental picture of what awaited them. A runway carved out of ancient volcanic rock on a barren coastline. Mountains visible in the distance under normal conditions. Weather that would be challenging, even with a fully functional aircraft. And they would arrive with barely enough hydraulic pressure to move the flight control surfaces, let alone deploy flaps and landing gear properly. In the main cabin, the announcement came through the passenger address speakers in Darnell's deliberately steady voice. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your pilot speaking. We are diverting to Keflavik, Iceland, where we will be making an emergency landing in approximately 45 minutes. I want to be completely honest with you about our situation. This will not be a normal landing. We have experienced significant systems failures, and the approach will be challenging. I need every one of you to follow the instructions of the cabin crew exactly and without hesitation. Secure all loose items. Review the brace position in your safety card, and understand that whatever happens in the next hour, we are going to do absolutely everything in our power to get you safely on the ground. The announcement ended. In the first-class cabin, Richard Whitmore listened to the calm professional certainty in that voice and felt something fundamental shift in his chest. That was not the voice of a man who lacked competence or qualification. That was the voice of a professional, someone who had confronted danger before and navigated successfully to the other side. Whatever assumptions Richard had made about the man in the wrinkled sweater, they were crumbling, now dissolving in the acid bath of undeniable evidence. Sullivan made her way through the cabin, checking on passengers, answering anxious questions with the measured confidence of someone trained to deliver difficult news. When she reached Richard's seat in the premium cabin, she paused. Mr. Whitmore, how are you holding up? Richard looked up at her. His bourbon glass sat empty and abandoned on the tray table. No, I'm not holding up well at all. He hesitated, then continued, the words emerging slowly as if each one required separate effort. The man flying this aircraft. I doubted him. When he stood up and claimed he could help, my immediate reaction was that he couldn't possibly be qualified. And what do you think now? Now I'm sitting here desperately hoping he's skilled enough to save my life. Richard's voice cracked slightly, and I'm being forced to examine what that initial reaction reveals about who I actually am. It reveals that you're human. Dr. Sullivan's response was gentle, but carried no false comfort. We all carry assumptions we prefer not to acknowledge. What ultimately matters is what we choose to do once we recognize them. She moved on to check other passengers, leaving Richard alone with his thoughts and his empty glass and his crumbling self-image. The aircraft hummed steadily around him, its engines maintaining their rhythm, its crew fighting invisible battles in the cockpit. And for the first time in many years, Richard Whitmore offered something resembling an authentic prayer. Not for himself, for the man in the cockpit who had every reason to resent the doubters and had chosen to save them anyway. The final 30 minutes of the approach became a precisely choreographed performance between two men who had been complete strangers before this night. Darnell flew while Derek managed systems-checked procedures, monitored the hydraulic pressure that continued its inexorable decline. They communicated in the compressed shorthand of aviation professionals, each exchange advancing them incrementally closer to the runway waiting in the Arctic darkness. Hydraulic pressure status: 38% and falling. Landing gear configuration: gear indicates down and locked. 3 green lights confirmed. Flap extension: partial extension only. We're getting approximately half of rated deflection. Expect significantly altered flight characteristics on final approach. The aircraft descended through the clouds, its wounded systems straining to maintain coordinated flight. Darnell could feel the difference in the yoke, the substantially increased effort required for each control input, the sluggishness that accompanied diminished hydraulic power. Flying this crippled aircraft was like trying to steer through thick mud, every movement demanding more strength and concentration than it should. Then the cloud layer broke apart beneath them, and Iceland emerged from the darkness. The runway stretched across the volcanic landscape, a ribbon of lights cutting through the snow and rock, a narrow pathway to survival. Fire trucks were already positioned along the taxiways, their emergency lights flashing red and blue against the white ground. Ambulances waited in designated areas. Crash rescue vehicles stood ready with foam cannons deployed. Atlantic 447 Keflavik Tower, you are cleared to land runway 31. Current winds are 250 degrees at 28 knots gusting to 42. All emergency services are standing by for your arrival. Good luck, sir. Roger Keflavik. Atlantic 447 is on final approach. The approach began. Darnell guided the wounded aircraft down the electronic glide path, fighting the gusting crosswind that tried to push them off course, compensating for the drastically reduced control authority with inputs that demanded every ounce of his strength and concentration. Derek called out altitudes and airspeeds in a steady professional stream, his voice the anchor that kept them oriented in the chaos of the moment. 1,000 feet above ground. The PPI lights showed them slightly low on the glide path. Darnell added power, felt the engines respond, watched the visual indicators correct. 800 feet. The runway lights were clearer now, the threshold numbers painted on the pavement visible through the windscreen. A gust of wind struck them, and the aircraft lurched left. Darnell corrected with calm precision. 600 feet. Hydraulic pressure had dropped to 32%. The controls were becoming heavier with each passing second, the effort required to maintain precise flight path increasing exponentially. 400 feet, 300, 200. The threshold markings passed beneath them. The runway stretched ahead 10,000 feet of concrete salvation waiting to receive them. 100 feet, 50 feet. Flare now. Darnell pulled back on the yoke, commanding the nose to rise, bleeding off airspeed, transforming their descent into a landing. The controls resisted with frightening intensity. The hydraulics strained audibly. For one terrible moment, he genuinely believed the aircraft would not respond. Then the main landing gear touched concrete. The impact was harder than any normal landing, a violent collision of aluminum and pavement that sent shockwaves through the entire airframe. The aircraft bounced, rose back into the air, descended, and struck again. The nose gear slammed down with a bang. The thrust reversers deployed with a roar. The brakes engaged with everything they had remaining. 4,000 feet of runway remaining. The aircraft was decelerating, but not rapidly enough. The end of the runway was approaching faster than their speed was decreasing. 2,000 feet remaining. Darnell pressed harder on the brake pedals with both feet. The hydraulic system screamed in protest. The airframe shuddered violently. 1,000 feet remaining. Derek's voice was tight with terror. "We're not going to silence." The aircraft stopped. 300 feet of paved runway remained ahead of them. Emergency vehicles were already racing toward their position, lights flashing, sirens wailing into the Arctic night. In the cockpit, Darnell's hands remained locked on the yoke, his entire body frozen in position, every muscle trembling, with the combined aftermath of adrenaline and extreme physical exertion. "We made it." Derek's voice emerged barely above a whisper. "We actually made it." Darnell said nothing. He was thinking about Imani, about the promise he had sworn to keep, about the 7-year-old girl in Chicago who was waiting for her father to walk through the door. He had kept his word. Against every odd. Against every system failure. Against every assumption and doubt. He had kept his word. The evacuation began within seconds of the aircraft coming to its final stop. Emergency slides deployed from multiple doors with explosive hisses, bright yellow pathways to safety extending down to the frozen tarmac. Passengers climbed out of the wounded aircraft and onto Icelandic soil, their breath forming clouds in the sub-zero air, their faces showing the particular exhaustion that comes only from prolonged mortal terror, followed by unexpected survival. Medical teams rushed toward the forward door where the cardiac patient was being carefully extracted on a portable stretcher. His face gray, but his eyes open, still alive, because strangers had worked together to keep him breathing. Darnell remained in the cockpit for several minutes after the last passenger had evacuated. His hands still feeling the phantom resistance of the yoke, his mind slowly processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. Derek Holloway had disappeared into the organized chaos of emergency response, swept away by medical personnel, insisting on examining him for shock. Captain Billy Callahan had been the first evacuated, carried on a stretcher by paramedics, speaking rapid Icelandic into their portable radios. But before the paramedics took him away, Callahan had regained consciousness. His eyes, clouded with pain and confusion, had found Darnell standing beside the captain's seat. "Wait." His voice was weak but carried an urgent undertone. "I know you." Darnell stepped closer. The two men looked at each other across years and continents and impossible circumstances. "Afghanistan, 2015. Callahan's eyes widened with dawning recognition despite his injuries. "Your ghost, the F-16 pilot who provided cover for our extraction. You kept us alive that night until rescue arrived." The memory crystallized fully in Darnell's mind. The night rescue mission. The helicopter crew pinned down by enemy fire in a mountain valley. Darnell flying cover in absolute darkness, making strafing runs to suppress hostile positions, keeping 8 men alive through 6 hours of hell until ground forces could reach them. "I remember that night." Callahan reached out and gripped Darnell's hand with surprising strength. 8 years I've been trying to find you. 8 years wanting to thank you properly. Now I owe you my life twice." Darnell squeezed the hand back. "Just focus on recovering. That's all the thanks I need." The paramedics carried Callahan away into the Arctic night. Darnell watched him go, this man whose life had intersected with his twice now, in 2 different skies on 2 different nights when everything could have ended in tragedy. The universe apparently had its own sense of narrative structure. The silence in the empty cockpit felt almost sacred. No engine noise, no warning chimes, no radio chatter, just the distant sounds of emergency response and the occasional thump of boots on the tarmac below. Darnell finally released his grip on the armrests and stood. His legs trembled, the delayed reaction of a body that had held itself together through pure will, finally acknowledging its exhaustion. He walked slowly through the main cabin. The seats were empty now. Personal belongings scattered in the aisles where passengers had abandoned them during the rushed evacuation. A child-stuffed elephant lay forgotten beneath seat 12C. A paperback novel had been torn nearly in half, its pages scattered like fallen leaves. The overhead bins hung open, their contents disgorged during the rough landing. At the forward door, Darnell paused. The emergency slide stretched down to the tarmac, a bright yellow pathway to a world that would never look at him the same way again. Beyond it, he could see the organized chaos of emergency response. Fire trucks, ambulances, police vehicles, media vans that had somehow already arrived, their satellite dishes pointed at the sky, preparing to broadcast his story to the world. He was not ready for any of that. A figure appeared at the bottom of the slide. Nadine Foster climbed back up with the practiced agility of someone who had performed this maneuver in countless training exercises, appearing at the door with her uniform disheveled and her face showing tracks where tears had flowed. "The authorities are requesting your presence. They need statements. And the passengers—" She paused, her voice catching. "They want to thank you. All of them." Darnell nodded slowly. "I'll be down in a moment. Take whatever time you need." She disappeared back down the slide, and Darnell was alone again with the wounded aircraft. He pulled out his phone and navigated to the voice memos, to the message he had recorded for Imani before everything changed. He pressed play. "Hey, baby girl. It's Daddy. I'm at the airport now, about to get on the big plane to London." His own voice from another lifetime, 12 hours ago, before everything transformed. "And remember, I love you bigger than the sky, bigger than all the skies in the whole universe." He had kept that promise. Against all probability, against every cascading failure, against every doubting whisper, he had found a way home. The Keflavik Airport terminal had been converted into an impromptu triage and reunion center. Passengers sat in clusters throughout the space, wrapped in emergency blankets, provided by Icelandic Red Cross volunteers, being attended by medical personnel and trauma counselors. The cardiac patient had been stabilized and transported to Reykjavik's main hospital. Captain Callahan was undergoing evaluation for his head injury. Derek Holloway sat in a quiet corner, phone pressed to his ear, tears streaming down his face as he spoke to his pregnant wife. When Darnell finally entered the terminal, the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Conversation stopped, heads turned. A wave of recognition swept through the crowd as people realized who had just walked through the door. The man from seat 8A, the man who had saved their lives. An elderly woman approached first. She was small and frail, her white hair disheveled, her hands trembling as she reached for his arm. "Thank you." Her voice emerged barely above a whisper. "My grandson is getting married next month. I thought I would never live to see it. Thank you for giving me that gift." Darnell nodded, uncomfortable with the intensity of attention. "I'm just glad everyone is safe." Others followed in a steady stream. A businessman who had spent the entire flight bargaining with God. A young mother cradling her infant daughter. A college student who had been returning from a semester abroad. One by one they approached him, shook his hand, embraced him, wept against his shoulder. Each encounter added weight to the magnitude of what had happened, what he had prevented, what could so easily have been. Colonel Crawford found him after the initial wave of gratitude had subsided. The Navy man had recovered his characteristic composure, his posture military straight, his bearing once again that of a career officer accustomed to command. "I owe you a proper apology." Darnell met his eyes. "You don't owe me anything, Colonel. You did what you thought was necessary to protect those passengers. I doubted you based on factors that had nothing to do with your actual capabilities. You verified me. There's an important difference." Darnell's voice carried no resentment. "You made me prove myself, and once I had, you stepped aside and let me work. That's not prejudice. That's appropriate caution in an emergency situation." Crawford considered this perspective for a moment. Then he extended his hand. "Regardless of how you choose to frame it, you have my complete respect, without reservation." They shook hands firmly. Two veterans from different services, different generations, different backgrounds, finding common ground in the aftermath of shared crisis. Dr. Sullivan appeared next, having finally transferred her medical responsibilities to the Icelandic emergency responders. She looked exhausted, her professional composure cracked by hours of providing critical care with inadequate equipment and supplies. The cardiac patient is going to survive. She lowered herself into a chair beside Darnell. Harold Preston, 73 years old, retired professor of European history. He's in surgery now, but the doctors are optimistic about his recovery. I'm glad to hear it. You gave us the time we needed. She studied him with an expression combining gratitude and professional assessment. If you had tried for Shannon instead of Keflavik, if you had taken even 20 minutes longer, he would have died. We all would have died. Darnell absorbed this quietly. He had made calculations, weighed competing risks, chosen the option offering the best probability of collective survival. Hearing the mathematics of that decision stated so directly carried its own weight. You're a remarkable person, Mr. Braddock. I'm just a software engineer from Chicago who used to fly planes. Dr. Sullivan smiled, tired but genuine. You're considerably more than that, and everyone on that aircraft understands it now. Richard Whitmore approached last. He had been standing at the back of the terminal observing the procession of gratitude, clearly wrestling with something internal. His expensive clothing was rumpled beyond recognition. His carefully maintained executive demeanor had cracked and fallen away. He walked toward Darnell with the hesitant steps of a man approaching confession. I need to say something to you. Darnell waited. When you stood up on that plane and said you could help, I didn't believe you. Whitmore's voice was steady, but something beneath it trembled. Not because of anything you said. Not because of any evidence. I didn't believe you because of how you looked, because of where you were sitting, because of assumptions I carry that I've never wanted to examine. That's an honest admission. My grandson is 7 years old. Whitmore's eyes glistened. His father is black. I love that boy more than I've ever loved anything in my life. And tonight I realized that I would have looked at a grown-up version of him the same way I looked at you. With doubt, with skepticism, with assumptions that have nothing to do with capability and everything to do with prejudice I've pretended doesn't exist. Darnell studied the man before him, the CEO who had doubted him, the first-class passenger who had questioned whether someone from economy could possibly possess expertise, the grandfather confronting uncomfortable truths about himself. The assumptions we don't examine are the ones that cause the most damage. What matters is what you do with this recognition, what you choose to do tomorrow and the day after that. Whitmore nodded slowly. I don't know yet what that will look like, but I'm going to figure it out. I owe you that much. I owe my grandson that much. He turned and walked away before Darnell could respond. The Icelandic authorities arrived shortly afterward, a procession of officials in suits and uniforms requiring statements and documentation and detailed explanations of every decision made during the emergency. Darnell answered their questions with the same calm precision he had maintained throughout the crisis, recounting the sequence of events in technical detail. The officials took careful notes, exchanged significant glances, asked follow-up questions that revealed their own surprise at the magnitude of what had transpired. The replacement aircraft arrived at Keflavik 18 hours after the emergency landing. Every passenger chose to return to Chicago rather than continue to London. The airline accommodated without argument, understanding that the goodwill generated by flexibility far exceeded any logistical inconvenience. Darnell boarded last, escorted through a private entrance. The story had exploded across global news networks. Hero in Seat 8A, the passenger who saved Flight 447. Every headline competed for the most dramatic framing. He had declined all interview requests. The flight home took 7 hours. 7 hours of decompression, of processing, of gradual return to something resembling normal consciousness. Darnell slept for most of it, his body finally surrendering to exhaustion. When the pilot announced their descent into O'Hare, he was already awake, watching Chicago emerge through his window. The grid of streets, the curve of the lakeshore, the towers of downtown catching afternoon light. Home. The terminal erupted when he emerged from the jetway. Reporters with microphones, photographers with cameras, television crews with blinding lights, hundreds of ordinary people who had come simply to witness the man from the news. And in front of everyone holding a hand-drawn sign that read "Welcome Home, Daddy," in purple crayon stood Imani. The sight of her erased everything else. Security parted to let him through. Reporters shouted questions he didn't register. There was only Imani, and then his arms were around her, lifting her from the ground, pulling her against his chest. "Daddy!" Her voice was muffled against his shoulder. "Daddy, you came back. I promised, baby girl." "I know," she pulled back to look at his face. "I never doubted, not for 1 second." Lorraine appeared beside them, tears flowing freely. She wrapped her arms around both of them, creating a shelter of family. Darnell faced the microphones. "I have one statement. What happened on that flight was not the work of one person. It was everyone. The crew, the passengers, the medical professionals. Especially First Officer Derek Holloway, who stayed at his post through impossible conditions." A reporter pushed forward. "Mr. Braddock, can you comment on reports that you were initially doubted because of your appearance? People make assumptions. It's human nature. What matters is what happens after those assumptions are challenged. On that flight, people adjusted when evidence contradicted their expectations. That's growth. That's hope." He turned away from the cameras. Lorraine led them through a cleared corridor away from the chaos. The drive home felt like moving through a transformed city. Every traffic light was a gift. Every pedestrian was a life being lived. Imani sat in his lap the entire drive. "I knew you would be okay, Daddy. Because you promised, and you never break promises. I never will, baby girl." That night, Darnell sat on the edge of Imani's bed, Charlotte's Web open in his hands. They finished the final chapters together, Imani fighting sleep to hear every word. When the book ended, she looked up at him with those eyes that saw everything. "Daddy, were you scared up there?" "Yes, I was very scared, but you did it anyway. That's what courage is, baby girl. Not the absence of fear, the decision to act despite the fear." She processed this wisdom. Then she nodded. "I'm going to be brave like you when I grow up. You already are." He kissed her forehead and watched her surrender to sleep. The weeks following brought the expected avalanche: interview requests, book proposals, a Hollywood producer's voicemail, the mayor's office calling about ceremonies. Darnell declined everything. What he could not decline was the FAA investigation. 6 weeks after the emergency, he received formal notice requiring his testimony. The hearing took place in Washington in a conference room at FAA headquarters. Darnell told them everything. The failure pattern he had recognized, the similarity to military incidents, the software bug that had been documented, reported, and ignored. Then he told them about Maverick. Lieutenant Marcus Thompson was 26 years old when he died. He was one of the best pilots I ever knew. And he died because someone decided that fixing a known software defect cost more than a pilot's life was worth. The room went silent. I reported that defect myself 3 days before Maverick's crash. I filed the paperwork. Nothing happened. The fleet kept flying. And Maverick died. He leaned forward. Flight 447 experienced the same failure pattern, 4 years later, on a civilian aircraft, with 242 innocent people, the same bug, the same cascade. The only difference was that someone happened to be on board who knew how to fight it. How many coincidences do we need before we admit the system is broken? After the hearing, a woman approached him in the corridor, middle-aged, graying hair, eyes holding familiar grief. She clutched a photograph. "I'm Eleanor Thompson, Marcus's mother." The air left Darnell's lungs. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm so sorry." She shook her head. "You have nothing to apologize for. My son died because of decisions made by men who never faced consequences. You tried to stop it. You reported the defect. It wasn't enough." "No." Her voice cracked. "It wasn't. But what you did on that flight, exposing the truth, forcing them to acknowledge what they covered up, that gave my son's death meaning." She pressed the photograph into his hands. a young man in a flight suit grinning with boundless confidence. He talked about you all the time. His mentor. His hero. He wanted to fly just like Ghost. Darnell could not speak. Thank you. For saving those people. For telling the truth. For making sure my son didn't die in vain. She walked away before he could respond. 6 months after the emergency, the FAA released its findings. 400 pages documenting systematic failure. The software defect had been identified in military aircraft 6 years earlier. Reports had been filed, escalated, and shelved. Both Boeing and military procurement offices had chosen not to act. The report formally acknowledged that Lieutenant Marcus Thompson had died as a direct result of the defect. Boeing announced a voluntary grounding of 73 aircraft. The FAA implemented new oversight protocols. Congress held hearings. Change was coming. Richard Whitmore kept his word. 8 months after the flight, his email arrived. I am not writing to claim transformation. I am writing to report progress. I've established a mentorship program for young entrepreneurs from underrepresented backgrounds. I've endowed a scholarship fund for first-generation students. I've begun therapy to examine assumptions I've carried for 58 years. The man I was on that flight was not who I want to be. I don't know if I will succeed, but I am trying, every day. Darnell replied simply, Progress is enough. Keep trying. The exchange planted something in his mind, a question he had been avoiding. What if he went back to the sky? The thought surfaced during a Saturday at the park, watching Imani race across the grass. A year had passed. Spring had become summer. She was 8 now, 2 inches taller, still obsessed with dinosaurs, still fierce and funny and full of questions. She ran back to him, collapsed onto the bench. Daddy, can I ask you something? Anything. Baby girl, do you miss flying? Yes. I do. She nodded. The TV said you were really good at it. Grandma says the same thing. She says the sky was your first home. Imani was quiet for a moment. Then I don't want you to be sad, Daddy. Sometimes I see you looking at the sky like you're missing something important. The observation stripped away every defense. I made you a promise. I promised I would always be here. I know. Her hand found his. But what if you could do both? What do you mean? What if you could fly and be here, like fly during the day and come home at night? Madison's daddy is a pilot. He's home almost every night. Darnell stared at his daughter. The simplicity of her logic cut through years of self-imposed limitation. Would you be okay with that? If Daddy flew planes again? Daddy, you saved all those people because you know how to fly. She paused. I think maybe you're supposed to fly. And I think maybe you can love me. And love the sky. They don't have to be separate. When did you get so wise? I'm almost 9. That's basically a grown-up. Darnell laughed and pulled her close. He was going to fly again. The training program took 18 months. Ground school on nights and weekends. Simulator hours whenever possible. The material was both familiar and foreign. Commercial aviation had its own culture different from military operations. He excelled anyway. United Airlines hired him 3 months after he received his commercial license. Domestic routes only. No overnights. Maximum flexibility for family. His first flight as captain departed O'Hare on a Tuesday morning. 212 passengers bound for Denver. Routine weather. But as Darnell settled into the captain's seat and placed his hands on the controls, something that had been missing for years clicked back into place. The engines spooled up. The aircraft lifted off. He was home. That evening, he landed at O'Hare and walked through the terminal. Imani was waiting at Arrival's backpack, still on from school. Daddy. How was your flight? Perfect. How was school? Boring. But I aced my math test. That's my girl. They drove through Chicago as evening deepened. Imani chattering about her day. The apartment waiting for them. Tomorrow he would fly again. But tonight, he was home. 3 years had passed since the night over the Atlantic. The software bug had been fixed. Maverick's name appeared in the FAA report as a casualty whose death had ultimately saved others. Derek Holloway was a captain now. His son Darnell Marcus Holloway was 2 years old. Captain Callahan had retired. His letter arrived one autumn afternoon, handwritten, telling the full story of that night in Afghanistan. You saved my life twice. I don't believe in coincidence anymore. I believe in providence. They exchanged letters now every few months. Two men who had found each other across impossible odds. Colonel Crawford sent Christmas cards, still telling people about the night I met a real hero. They never believe he was wearing a wrinkled sweater. Dr. Sullivan established the Darnell Braddock Fellowship in Crisis Medicine at Johns Hopkins. Sometimes other people get to decide how you're remembered, and Richard Whitmore's mentorship program had helped 200 young entrepreneurs. His last email included a photograph Richard with his grandson, now 10, standing in front of a science fair project about aerospace engineering. He wants to be a pilot, like the man who saved his grandfather. Darnell printed that photograph and added it to the box beneath his bed. The box that was no longer sealed. The past was no longer something to hide from. It was something to honor. One evening, driving home after a flight, Imani grew quiet in the back seat. Daddy, yeah, baby girl, do you think Mommy knows about everything that happened? I believe she knows. I believe she's somewhere watching over us, proud of who you're becoming. Do you think she's proud of you too? I hope so. I try to be the man she believed I could you'd be. Imani reached across and took his hand. I think she's really proud, Daddy, because I am. And she loved us even more than we love each other. He could not speak. He simply held his daughter's hand as they drove through Chicago toward home. Can we get ice cream? Absolutely. What flavor? Chocolate with sprinkles. Obviously. Obviously. They sat at a small table by the window, watching the city, talking about nothing and everything. When they finally got home, the apartment was warm and quiet. Darnell stood at the window looking out at the Chicago night. The L train rumbled past, familiar. Constant. Home. Tomorrow he would fly again. 200 passengers to wherever they needed to go. Then home to this apartment. To his daughter. To the life he had built from wreckage and hope. The sky would always be there. And so would he. Both promises kept. Both loves honored. Imani appeared in the doorway. I love you, Daddy. I love you bigger than the sky, baby girl. Bigger than all the skies. Bigger than all the skies in the whole universe. Forever. Home.